4 minutes. That is all it took to end an empire's dream of ruling the Pacific. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 25-year-old Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 torpedo bombers toward the Japanese fleet, knowing most of his men would not return. He was right. Every single aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 was shot down. 29 men died in the water, cut apart by Japanese Zero fighters that swept down from the clouds to finish what their guns had started. Not one torpedo found its target. It looked, for those brief and brutal minutes, like a total and pointless massacre. But high above, where the Zeros had abandoned their post to hunt the low-flying Americans, the sky had been left open, wide open. American dive bombers, invisible until the last second, tipped their wings and fell out of the sun. In the span of 6 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, were transformed into floating infernos. The Battle of Midway did not turn on strategy alone. It turned on sacrifice, on a single desperate charge that cost nearly everything and changed everything. This is how the United States broke the back of the Japanese Empire in one impossible morning. The war had come to Japan not with a declaration, but with a slow strangulation. Since the early 1930s, Japanese conquests in China had caused ever-increasing friction with the United States. Starting in mid-1940, the United States imposed a prohibition on the export of arms, scrap iron, and other critical strategic resources to the Japanese Empire. Then, in July 1941, America led an international oil embargo and froze all Japanese overseas assets. The effect was devastating. 90% of Japan's oil had been imported, and her stockpiles were rapidly dwindling. Every gauge in every tank across the empire was a clock ticking down toward paralysis. Japan's leadership faced a choice that felt to them like no choice at all. Either bow to American pressure and abandon a decade of conquest, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the resources of Southeast Asia by force. They chose force. But first, a single obstacle had to be removed. The American Pacific Fleet, anchored at Hawaii, within striking distance of every convoy Japan would need to send south. In the darkness before dawn on December 7, 1941, 360 Japanese bombers and fighters lifted off from carriers 230 miles north of Oahu. Below them, Pearl Harbor still slept. Sailors lingered over breakfast, church bells were being readied for Sunday services, and the great battleships lay moored in pairs along Battleship Row, engines cold, decks quiet. Within minutes, the harbor became a wall of fire and black smoke that could be seen for miles. The battleship Arizona took a bomb straight through her deck into her forward magazine and vanished in a single explosion that killed more than 1,000 men in seconds. In 2 hours, 18 American warships were sunk or crippled, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and more than 3,500 Americans killed or wounded. It was by any measure a stunning victory. The following afternoon, the United States declared war. For the men who had planned it, the raid was a triumph tainted by an uneasy fact. The American aircraft carriers, the ships that mattered most, had been at sea that morning. They had escaped untouched. Japanese reconnaissance photographs, studied late into the night by staff officers aboard Yamamoto's flagship, confirmed it beyond doubt. The harbor's oil tanks, holding 4.5 million barrels of fuel that the entire Pacific Fleet depended on, had also been left standing, overlooked in the rush to strike the warships instead. It was a mistake that would matter more than anyone in Tokyo yet realized. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, understood what almost no one else in the Imperial High Command wanted to hear. He had studied at Harvard. He had served in Washington as a naval attaché. He knew America's factories, her steel mills, her shipyards, in a way his colleagues did not. He had warned before the war began that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that a long war against American industry could not be won. Once the decision for war was made, though, Yamamoto committed himself entirely to winning it his way, fast, decisive, before the sleeping giant fully woke. His answer was Midway, a speck of coral and sand 1,136 miles west of Hawaii, valuable chiefly because it sat close enough to threaten Pearl Harbor itself. Yamamoto's plan was elegant and merciless. Japanese forces would invade Midway, and the American Pacific Fleet, unable to ignore the threat to Hawaii, would sail out to defend it. Waiting for them, hidden beyond the horizon, would be the most powerful carrier strike force in the world, 4 fleet carriers under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, ready to finish what Pearl Harbor had started. There was one problem Yamamoto did not know about. In a windowless basement beneath the Pearl Harbor Naval Yard, a rumpled, brilliant naval officer named Commander Joseph Rochefort had spent months living on canned soup and cigarettes, hunched over intercepted Japanese naval code. He worked in a smoke-filled room lit by bare bulbs, often in a worn smoking jacket instead of his uniform, surrounded by teams of cryptanalysts drowning in punch cards and stacks of intercepted traffic that arrived faster than any of them could read it. Sleep came in short stretches on a cot in the corner. By the spring of 1942, his team had partially broken JN-25, the cipher the Imperial Navy used for its most sensitive communications. Partially was the operative word. Whole messages remained maddening puzzles of half-translated fragments, single words surrounded by gaps where meaning should have been. By early May, Rochefort had a growing suspicion. References kept appearing to an operation targeting a location coded simply as AF. He believed AF was Midway. His superiors in Washington were not convinced. The stakes of being wrong were enormous. If the fleet was committed to the wrong location, the war in the Pacific could be lost in a single afternoon. Rochefort proposed a simple trick. He had the garrison at Midway send an uncoded radio message claiming their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Days later, on May 12, an American listening post intercepted a Japanese transmission. AF is short of water. There it was, confirmation. The Japanese plan, built on secrecy and surprise, was already broken before a single ship had sailed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was a different kind of leader than his Japanese counterpart. Where Yamamoto commanded through sheer force of reputation, Nimitz led by trusting the men beneath him. He had taken command in the smoking wreckage of Pearl Harbor and refused to place blame on the officers who had been caught unprepared. That trust, extended to men like Rochefort, would prove decisive. Nimitz believed the codebreakers. He committed his entire available carrier strength, 3 ships against Japan's 4, to a gamble that intelligence alone had made possible. Among the men who would carry that gamble into battle was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, a broad-shouldered half-Sioux officer from South Dakota who commanded Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the carrier Hornet. Waldron was not a polished aristocrat of the Naval Academy set. He was blunt, intense, and utterly devoted to his 15 crews, the kind of commander who walked the hangar deck at night, checking on his mechanics by name. In the days before the battle, he wrote a letter to his men that read less like an order and more like a farewell. He told them that whatever happened, he wanted each plane to attack, alone if necessary, until the enemy was destroyed. He closed it with a line his men would never forget. Good luck, happy landings, and give them hell. His squadron would fly the oldest, slowest torpedo bombers in the fleet, the Douglas Devastator, already obsolete by 1942, underpowered and lightly armed against the fighters they would soon face. Waldron knew this. He said it did not matter. Across the Pacific, aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo carried a different burden. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the accumulated striking power of a nation that had never lost a major naval battle in this war. His pilots were the most experienced in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor and a dozen victories since. Confidence in the fleet ran so high that some officers privately worried the Americans might simply refuse to fight, might huddle inside Pearl Harbor rather than risk annihilation. They had no idea the Americans were already waiting, hidden beyond the reach of every scout plane and submarine picket the Imperial Navy had sent ahead to watch for them. By late May, the pieces were moving. Nagumo's carrier strike force departed the anchorage of Hashirajima and turned east, steaming for Midway beneath cloud cover that hid them from prying eyes. Behind them followed Yamamoto's main battle fleet, 7 battleships strong, confident that once the American carriers were lured into range, the guns of his great ships would finish whatever the aircraft had started. To the south, a separate invasion force of transports and troops moved toward the island itself, carrying 5,000 men who expected to simply walk ashore. From Pearl Harbor, the American carriers slipped out with equal secrecy. Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, left first. Task Force 17 followed 2 days later, centered on the carrier Yorktown, a ship that should not have been ready to sail at all. Yorktown had been badly damaged weeks earlier in the Battle of the Coral Sea, a savage clash that had already reshaped the coming fight in ways neither side fully understood. Naval engineers in Pearl Harbor had estimated 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. When Nimitz himself came down to inspect the damage in dry dock, wading through water still pooled in her ruptured compartments, he asked his repair officers bluntly how long they needed. Told 90 days, he answered that they had 3, because the ship had to be ready to sail by the following Saturday. 1,500 men worked around the clock in showers of welding sparks, cutting away twisted steel and patching a wounded carrier back into a fighting ship, dockyard crews still aboard, tools still in hand, as she pulled away from the pier. It was, by any reasonable standard, impossible. It was done anyway. All 3 American carriers steamed toward a rendezvous point 325 miles northeast of Midway, a location the crews had nicknamed Point Luck. There they would wait, hidden, for the moment their scouts confirmed the Japanese fleet was in range. Nimitz's orders to his commanders were simple and calculated. Accept no undue risk, but seize any opportunity to inflict damage on the enemy on approximately equal or superior terms. Neither side yet knew exactly where the other was, but one side believed it held the element of surprise, and was wrong, utterly and fatally wrong, in a way that would only become clear once the shooting started. On the morning of June 3rd, an American reconnaissance aircraft caught the first glimpse of Japanese ships approaching from the west, dark shapes strung across a gray, restless sea. The waiting was almost over. The first blow had already been struck, weeks before, in a stretch of ocean far to the south called the Coral Sea. It was there, in early May, that Japanese and American carriers fought each other for the first time in history without either fleet ever coming within sight of the other's ships. An entirely new kind of naval war, fought at ranges of hundreds of miles, decided not by big guns but by aircraft, launched from decks the enemy could not even see on the horizon. American dive bombers had caught the light carrier Shoho early in the fighting, sinking her within minutes under a hail of bombs and torpedoes, a pilot's radio call of Scratch 1 flat top becoming an instant legend among the American fleet. The Japanese, badly shaken by the loss, called off an invasion fleet bound for Port Moresby and turned it back toward Rabaul. Days later, the 2 sides' remaining carriers finally found each other. The battle had ended in a trade. The Japanese sank the American carrier Lexington, a ship large enough that her loss felt catastrophic, her flight deck ripped by internal explosions until she had to be scuttled by her own escorts. But the Japanese carrier Shokaku had taken 3 bomb hits so severe she would need months in dry dock, and her sister ship Zuikaku, though physically untouched, had lost so many of her aircrew in the fighting that she had no way to rebuild a strike force in time for what came next. Japanese commanders called Coral Sea a victory. In every way that mattered for the battle now approaching, it was not. 2 of Japan's finest carriers, ships that could have tipped the coming fight decisively in Nagumo's favor, were absent from the order of battle before a single shot had been fired at Midway. Yamamoto did not know, not yet, just how badly he would come to need them before the day was over. Back in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz could do nothing now but wait for radio reports and trust the men he had sent to sea. He had staked the entire Pacific Fleet, 3 carriers against Japan's 4, on a chain of intelligence that ran from a windowless basement in Hawaii through the judgment of commanders 3,000 miles away. There was no way to recall the ships now, no way to adjust the plan once the 2 fleets converged. Everything depended on timing, on luck, and on men he could not see making decisions in the middle of an ocean he could only imagine. At dawn on June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through calm seas 240 miles northwest of Midway Island. The sky was streaked with high cloud, the sea a deep, quiet blue, and the air carried the particular stillness that settles over a fleet in the last hour before battle. On their decks, mechanics in stained coveralls moved between rows of aircraft, checking engines by lamplight, the smell of aviation fuel and salt air thick around them. Pilots ate a hurried breakfast in ready rooms lit by dim red bulbs, some writing brief letters home, others simply sitting in silence with their thoughts. At 04:30, Nagumo launched a strike of 108 aircraft against Midway's airfield, its hangars, and its fuel stores, engines roaring one after another into the pale morning light as aircraft lifted off in practiced, disciplined intervals. Behind them he held back a reserve of aircraft on his carriers, armed with armor-piercing bombs in case American warships were sighted. He had no idea that American warships were already close enough to see his own scout planes on the horizon, closing the distance under radio silence while he prepared to strike an island that had, in truth, already served its purpose as bait. Midway's defenders, warned by radar and by the codebreakers who had made this entire ambush possible, threw everything they had into the air before the Japanese bombs fell. Marine fighter pilots and obsolete Buffalo fighters, hopelessly outclassed by the nimble Japanese Zero, rose to meet the incoming strike and were slaughtered, 15 of 25 shot down in minutes. It was a brutal, one-sided massacre in the sky above the atoll. But it bought time, and time was the one thing the American plan needed most. Bombers based on Midway, old Vindicators and B-17s flying at extreme range, attacked the Japanese carriers directly and scored no hits at all, their bombs churning harmless white columns of seawater around ships that seemed untouchable. Below on Midway itself, the airfield burned. Fuel tanks split open and threw black smoke a mile into the sky, a dark column visible for miles across the flat, empty Pacific. Hangars collapsed into blackened frames, their steel girders twisted and glowing. Marines in slit trenches around the airfield watched their world tear itself apart, choking on smoke, deafened by explosions, unable to do anything but wait for the raid to end. And when the Japanese strike leader circled above the wreckage, satisfied with the destruction but aware that runways and gun emplacements still functioned, he radioed back to Nagumo's flagship a message that would change the course of the entire battle. There is need for a second attack. It was, on its surface, a simple tactical request. In practice, it created an agonizing dilemma. Nagumo's reserve aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs meant for warships, not the high-explosive bombs needed to finish off an airfield. If American ships appeared, he needed those armor-piercing weapons ready. If they did not, Midway's defenses needed to be silenced for good. Nagumo hesitated only briefly before ordering his air crews to rearm the reserve strike with bombs suited to a second strike on the island. Mechanics began the laborious process of hauling armor-piercing bombs back down to the magazines and hoisting incendiary and high-explosive bombs up to the flight deck, a task that took precious minutes on every one of the 4 carriers at once. Sweating crews wrestled 1,000-pound bombs onto trolleys and rolled them through cramped passageways below the hangar decks, while others worked feverishly to refuel and rearm the returning Midway strike aircraft as they landed one by one. Decks that should have been clear were suddenly crowded with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft in various states of readiness, a floating powder keg that none of the men laboring over it could see for what it had become. Then, at 0728, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone launched late due to a catapult malfunction that had delayed it by half an hour, a delay that would echo through every decision made in the hours that followed, finally reached the end of its search pattern and spotted something that froze the blood of every officer aboard Akagi's bridge. 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighted. The message crackled over the radio in fragments, incomplete, maddeningly vague, forcing Nagumo and his staff to make decisions on the barest sliver of information. American ships. Carriers, though the scout pilot did not say so immediately, uncertain and unwilling to commit to a claim that would upend the entire battle plan. Nagumo now faced an impossible choice with an impossibly short window to make it. Rearm his aircraft yet again, back to armor-piercing bombs meant for ships, delaying any strike against the newly discovered enemy fleet by precious additional minutes, or launch immediately with the mixed, disorganized loadout currently on his decks and risk an uncoordinated, weakened attack. He chose to rearm again, betting that he had time before the American carriers could strike first. He did not have that time. 325 miles to the northeast, aboard the carrier Hornet, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had received the sighting reports and was already strapped into his cockpit. He believed, with the fierce conviction of a man who had spent weeks preparing his squadron for exactly this moment, that he knew where the Japanese fleet would be, not where the projected course plotted by more senior officers suggested, but along a line his own instincts told him was correct. When Hornet's overall strike group turned toward the position favored by his air group commander, Waldron broke away. He took his 15 devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 on his own heading, alone, trusting a hunch built from years reading the sea and the enemy's habits. His hunch was right. At approximately 0920, Waldron spotted the Japanese carrier force below, exactly where he believed it would be, 4 gray shapes trailing white wakes against the deep blue of the open Pacific. He had found the entire Kido Butai alone, without fighter escort, without the dive bombers that should have accompanied his attack, without a single friendly aircraft in the sky to help him. He must have known in that moment, looking down at the full might of Japan's carrier strike force spread across the water below, exactly what the odds against him were. 15 obsolete aircraft against 4 carriers and their entire screen of escorting warships, with no help coming and no way to call any in. He attacked anyway. Waldron led his 15 lumbering devastators down toward the Japanese carriers, through a rising wall of anti-aircraft fire and a swarm of Zero fighters that fell on the slow American planes like hawks on wounded birds. Tracer fire crisscrossed the sky in glowing lines, and the water below churned white with shell splashes as every gun the Japanese fleet could bring to bear opened up at once. The devastators had no fighter cover, no altitude advantage, and airspeed barely faster than the ships they were trying to hit. One by one, they were torn from the sky, trailing smoke and flame as they cartwheeled into the sea. Waldron's own aircraft caught fire, and he was seen standing in his cockpit, trying to beat out the flames with his bare hand, before his plane fell into the sea. Every single devastator of Torpedo Squadron 8 was shot down. Of the 30 men who had taken off that morning, only one survived, Ensign George Gay, who ditched his shattered aircraft into the ocean and hid beneath a floating seat cushion, treading water and watching the battle unfold from the surface, only a few hundred yards from the burning hulks he had tried so desperately to sink. Not one of Waldron's torpedoes found its target, but the sacrifice was not without consequence. To destroy the low, slow devastators, the Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level, exactly where Waldron's attack had come from, stripping away the fighter cover that should have guarded the carriers at altitude. Minutes later, 2 more American torpedo squadrons, from Enterprise and Yorktown, arrived and suffered similarly brutal losses, and Zero fighters raced back and forth across the water, finishing them off. Of the 41 American torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 returned. It looked, from every angle available to the men fighting and dying in those planes, like a catastrophic and pointless failure. Wave after wave of American aircrew thrown against an enemy fleet that seemed entirely untouched. Their deaths brought nothing visible, no burning ship, no column of smoke, nothing but empty ocean and the widening rings where their aircraft had struck the water. High above, at nearly 20,000 feet, a very different story was unfolding. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 32 dive bombers from Enterprise, had searched for the Japanese fleet for nearly 2 hours, running low on fuel, following little more than a guess, and the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin its carriers. Every minute in the air burned fuel his squadron could not spare, and more than once McCluskey weighed the agonizing decision to turn back before his aircraft ran dry over open ocean, with no carrier deck to land on. McCluskey's fuel gauges were dropping toward the point of no return when, finally, he spotted them below, the 4 Japanese carriers, decks crowded with aircraft, fuel hoses, and stacked bombs from the frantic rearming effort, and no fighter cover above them at all. Every Zero that should have been guarding the sky at altitude was still down at wave height, hunting the last of the American torpedo planes, drawn away from the one position that mattered most by the very sacrifice that had seemed, only minutes earlier, to have accomplished nothing at all. McCluskey gave the order to attack. His dauntless dive bombers tipped over and fell out of the sun in near total silence, undetected until the last possible seconds. At almost the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown arrived independently from another direction, converging on the Japanese fleet in a coincidence of timing that would decide the entire Pacific War. The bombs began to fall at 10:22. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, took a hit that plunged directly into her hangar deck, detonating the bombs and torpedoes stacked there for the aborted second strike. The explosion tore through her innards and set off a chain of secondary blasts that turned the ship into an inferno within minutes, flames leaping through blown-out elevator shafts and licking up the sides of her superstructure. Kaga was struck by 4 bombs almost simultaneously, one of which hit near a fuel truck left carelessly on deck, spreading flaming gasoline across her flight deck and igniting the same volatile stockpile of ordnance that had doomed Akagi. Sailors trapped below decks pounded on jammed hatches as smoke poured through the ventilation system, and officers who moments earlier had been celebrating the destruction of Midway's airfield now scrambled for the rails as their ship burned beneath their feet. Soryu took 3 hits in as many minutes, each one tearing into decks packed with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft, secondary explosions ripping through her hull with such violence that men standing on nearby escort ships felt the shockwaves across the water. Within 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy were burning wrecks, their crews leaping into the sea or fighting hopeless fires below decks as ammunition continued to explode around them, the sky above them blackened by columns of smoke, visible for 50 miles. Admiral Nagumo, forced to abandon his blazing flagship by climbing down a rope into a waiting boat, transferred his command to the light cruiser Nagara, watching from the water as the ship he had commanded through Pearl Harbor, and every triumph since, became a funeral pyre, smoke and flame rising from her decks in a column that blotted out the morning sun. Only one Japanese carrier remained. Hiryu, sailing separately from her 3 sisters, had escaped the American dive bombers entirely, her decks untouched, her aircraft still fully armed and fueled. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, a fierce combative officer known throughout the fleet for his aggressive instincts, wasted no time on grief for the burning ships he could see on the horizon. Within the hour, he launched a counterattack against the American fleet. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters aimed squarely at the carrier Yorktown, whose position had been betrayed by the very aircraft that had helped sink his countrymen's ships. It was a defiant, almost desperate gesture. One badly outnumbered carrier, striking back against an enemy fleet that had just annihilated 3/4 of Japan's striking power in a single morning, a last act of aggression from a man who refused to accept that the battle was already lost. Yorktown's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 46 miles, giving her crew precious minutes to prepare, claxons echoing through her passageways as men raced to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with bursts of black smoke, and Wildcat fighters tore into the Japanese formation, but enough attackers broke through. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in quick succession, one blasting a hole through her flight deck, another destroying her boiler uptakes and bringing the great ship to a dead stop in the water, smoke pouring from her stack and drifting low across her decks. For a moment it seemed she might share the fate of her Japanese counterparts, the same fires and the same chaos that had consumed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu only hours before. Damage control parties, drawing on skills and discipline built over years of training, moved through smoke-filled compartments with hoses and axes, fought the fires and restored enough power to get Yorktown moving again at 19 knots within an hour, black smoke still trailing from her stack, but her flight deck clear enough to recover aircraft. It was a recovery that stunned the Japanese pilots who flew back over her position and reported with total confidence that they had left her sinking. It would not last. A second wave from Hiryu, torpedo bombers this time, found the wounded carrier again in the early afternoon. 2 torpedoes slammed into her port side, flooding her engine spaces and causing her to list so severely that her captain, fearing she would capsize and drown the men still trapped below, gave the order to abandon ship. Yorktown's crew went into the water in an orderly, practiced evacuation, sliding down ropes and cargo nets into a sea slicked with fuel oil, many of them convinced their ship would sink within the hour. Destroyers moved through the debris and the bobbing heads of survivors, hauling exhausted men up onto their decks by whatever grip could be found. She did not sink, not yet. She would remain afloat, a wounded, drifting hulk, for 2 more days, a silent testament to how close the balance of the entire battle had come to tipping the other way. Hiryu, having launched 2 devastating strikes and believing she had sunk not 1 but 2 American carriers, a mistaken report born of the confusion and smoke of battle, prepared for a 3rd attack at dusk, her exhausted air crews readying themselves for one more mission before nightfall. She never got the chance. American scout planes finally located her position in the late afternoon, and Enterprise launched a strike of 24 dive bombers, several of them survivors of the earlier attack on Nagumo's 3 carriers, now flying again with whatever aircraft remained serviceable, patched together from returning strikes and refueled in haste. They found Hiryu just before sunset, her deck crews still working to ready a fresh strike, and hit her with 4 bombs that tore open her forward flight deck, hurling one entire gun turret high into the air, and ignited fires that would burn through the night, lighting the darkening ocean for miles around. By dawn on June 5th, all 4 of Japan's fleet carriers that had sailed to Midway, the ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were sunk or sinking. Akagi, so badly damaged that her own escorts finished her with torpedoes, rather than let the drifting wreck fall into American hands, slipping beneath the waves just after 0500. Kaga, torn apart by internal explosions until she rolled over and sank beneath a column of black smoke visible for miles, taking hundreds of her crew down with her. Soryu, abandoned and finished off by an American submarine that found her still burning hours after the dive bomber attack, a final torpedo ending what the bombs had started. And Hiryu, scuttled by her own destroyers after Admiral Yamaguchi, in a final act of a code that had governed his entire life, chose to go down with his ship rather than survive the destruction of the fleet he commanded, standing at the rail as dawn broke over the burning water. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his battleship far to the west, received the reports in stunned silence, staff officers around him falling quiet as the scale of the disaster became clear. The pivotal battle he had gambled everything on, the Kessen Kantai meant to break American will, and force a negotiated peace, had instead broken the offensive power of the Imperial Japanese Navy in less than a single day. He gave the order to withdraw. The invasion of Midway, the entire purpose of the operation, was abandoned. There would be no landing, no captured airfield, no second Pearl Harbor. There would only be the long, silent voyage home, carrying the survivors of 4 sunken carriers and the heavy, unspoken knowledge that the balance of the entire Pacific War had shifted forever in a single morning. Yorktown drifted alone through the afternoon of June 4 and into the following day, a wounded giant listing quietly in an empty stretch of the Pacific, her fires out, but her power gone, kept afloat by nothing more than the stubbornness of the sea itself and the skill of the men who had built her. Destroyers circled her at a distance, watching for submarines, while her displaced crew waited aboard rescue ships, many of them staring back across the water at the ship they had abandoned, unwilling quite yet to believe she was truly finished. A skeleton salvage crew went back aboard on June 6th, determined to save the ship that had already survived Coral Sea and, against every expectation, survived the morning at Midway as well. They moved through darkened, listing passageways with flashlights, jettisoning heavy equipment and anything else that might right her in the water, working through the day, patching, pumping, fighting to bring her home. The Japanese submarine I-168 found her first. Slipping past her destroyer screen in the confusion of the salvage effort, the submarine fired a spread of torpedoes that struck both Yorktown and the destroyer Hamon, which had come alongside to provide power for the salvage crews. Hamon broke in half and sank within minutes, taking many of her crew down with her in an explosion that rippled through the water and stunned men swimming nearby. Yorktown, already grievously wounded, took 2 more hits to her already ruptured hull. This time, there was no miracle waiting. Overnight, the list grew worse, deck by deck, compartment by compartment, water finding its way through wounds no repair crew could reach. In the pre-dawn hours of June 7th, 5 days after she had steamed out of Pearl Harbor patched together by 1,500 exhausted workers, Yorktown finally rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. She went down slowly, almost gently, as if reluctant after everything she had endured, her flags and radio antennas, the last things visible above the surface, before the sea closed over her for good. The men who had fought to save her watched from nearby ships in silence, many of them having spent the better part of a week trying to keep this one ship alive. Of the 4 Japanese carriers that had sailed into battle that morning, none survived the day. Of the 3 American carriers, only Yorktown was ultimately lost. It was, on the ledger of ships alone, a battle the United States had won by an overwhelming margin. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk against a single American loss. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and aircrew killed against roughly 300 Americans. But the true cost of the victory was measured in more than hulls and casualty lists. Japan lost something at Midway that no shipyard could rebuild quickly. The pilots who died aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were not replaceable young recruits. They were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, of the conquest of the Philippines, of the string of victories that had carried the rising sun across half the Pacific in 6 months. Japan's training pipeline produced barely 100 qualified naval aviators a year, an elite selected and trained from adolescence. The United States, drawing on a vastly larger population and an educational system that could feed pilots into training programs by the thousands, would replace its losses within months. Japan never would. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent more than a day in the water, hidden beneath his floating seat cushion, watching the Japanese carriers burn and sink around him, watching the very battle his squadron had helped enable unfold from a vantage point no other American would ever have. He drifted close enough to hear the explosions aboard the burning carriers, close enough to watch Japanese sailors leap from their decks into the same water where he floated, an enemy he had tried to kill hours earlier, now dying within sight of him, in a battle that had, in its final outcome, already been decided. He was pulled from the sea by a Navy float plane the following day, half delirious with exhaustion, dehydration, and sunburn, one of only a handful of men from 3 entire torpedo squadrons who could describe, firsthand, what it meant to fly directly into the guns of the Imperial Japanese Navy without a single friendly fighter overhead. His account, and Waldron's final radio transmissions, would become part of the enduring memory of the battle, a reminder that the men in the slow, doomed devastators had not known they were creating the opening the dive bombers would exploit. They had simply refused to turn back, following orders and instinct, into a fight most of them must have known they would not survive. Admiral Nagumo, having lost his flagship and 3 of his 4 carriers in a single morning, returned to Japan with the survivors of his shattered fleet under a cloud of humiliation he would never fully escape, a commander who had entered the battle with the most powerful carrier force in the world and returned with barely a fraction of it intact. The Imperial Navy, wary of the effect true casualty figures might have on public morale, concealed the scale of the defeat from the Japanese people for months, quietly reassigning survivors and issuing only vague, celebratory reports of the battle. Wounded sailors returning to Japanese ports were kept isolated, their families told little, the truth of Midway locked away behind a wall of official secrecy that would not fully crumble until long after the war had ended. Admiral Yamaguchi, who had gone down with Hiryu rather than survive the destruction of his command, was mourned as one of the Imperial Navy's most promising officers, a loss that would be felt in every major engagement fought in the years that followed. He had been widely regarded, even among his rivals, as one of the few flag officers with the aggressive instincts to match Yamamoto's own, and his death aboard a burning carrier robbed Japan of a commander who might have shaped the later years of the war differently. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the entire operation, accepted responsibility for the defeat with the same discipline that had defined his career, though the loss weighed on him visibly for the remainder of the war, aides later recalling a man who seemed to age years in the months that followed Midway. He would be killed less than a year later when American fighters, guided by codebreakers not unlike the ones who had made Midway possible, intercepted and shot down his aircraft over the Solomon Islands, a death made possible by the very kind of intelligence work that had already broken his greatest plan. For Admiral Nimitz, the victory vindicated a strategy built entirely on trust, in his codebreakers, in his subordinate commanders, in a plan that had offered no guarantee of success. He praised the men of Midway without exaggeration or excess, aware that the margin between triumph and disaster had been thinner than anyone watching from Pearl Harbor could have known. A few minutes' difference in the timing of McCluskey's dive bombers, a slightly faster Japanese rearming effort, a different decision by Nagumo in the chaos of that morning, and the entire battle might have gone the other way. Commander Rochefort, the man whose basement full of cigarette smoke and half-broken code had made the ambush possible in the first place, received little public recognition for his role, his work remaining classified for decades, known only to the small circle of officers who understood exactly what his codebreakers had achieved. News of the victory reached the American public within days, though full details were kept from the press to protect the intelligence work that had made it possible, censors carefully stripping any reference to codebreaking from every published account of the battle. For a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still absorbing the string of Japanese victories that had swept across the Pacific in the war's first 6 months, Midway arrived as the first unmistakable sign that the tide could turn, a headline that gave weary families across the country something they had not had in 6 months of war news, genuine cause for hope. It would take 3 more years of brutal fighting across island after island, through Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, before the war in the Pacific was finally won. But after Midway, Japan would never again hold the strategic initiative. Every major operation from that point forward would be conducted by an Imperial Navy, fighting to defend what it held, never again able to dictate where and when the next great battle would be fought. Historians would spend decades studying the choices made in those few hours on June 4th, the code-breaking that stripped away Japan's surprise, the sacrifice of Waldron's squadron that opened the sky for the dive bombers, the razor-thin timing that allowed McCluskey and the Yorktown pilots to strike at the precise moment the Japanese decks were most vulnerable. None of it had been guaranteed. Much of it had depended on chance, on courage, and on men who could not have known, in the moment of their decisions, what those decisions would ultimately cost or achieve. Ordinary sailors and pilots who found themselves, for a few desperate hours, holding the fate of an entire war in their hands. What is certain is this: in the span of 6 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. 4 carriers that had helped bring war to Pearl Harbor now rested on the ocean floor. The men who had flown obsolete torpedo bombers into a wall of enemy fire, certain of their own deaths and uncertain of any purpose to their sacrifice, had in fact opened the door to the single greatest naval victory the United States would achieve in the entire war. Midway did not end the war in the Pacific, and 3 more years of hard fighting still lay ahead. But it ensured, in ways visible only in hindsight, that Japan would never again have the strength, the ships, or the veteran pilots needed to win it.